The field stretched until the horizon blurred into a haze of gold. It was a sea of wheat, swaying in rhythm with a constant, warm breeze. Here, the stalks stood tall, heavy with grain, catching the morning light in a shimmering, unbroken expanse. Adam and Eve walked these rows, but the rhythm of the land belonged to their sons. Cain and Abel moved through the landscape as if they were part of the earth itself. The air held only the sound of rustling stalks and the distant drift of wind across the hills. There was no boundary to the light, no edge to the harvest. Everything provided, and everything remained still. Cain leaned into the labor of the soil, his movement steady and rhythmic, while Abel moved toward the higher ground where the grass grew thick and short. They were the center of this world, two figures carving paths through the abundance. The sun climbed higher, warming the stalks until they glowed like embers. It was a life defined by the harvest and the horizon, a vast existence where every day mirrored the last in quiet, undisturbed labor. Cain spent his hours locked in the rows of grain. He worked the earth with a rhythmic intensity, his palms pressed deep into the dark, damp soil until the dirt settled into every crease of his skin. He did not mind the grit or the heat. He measured his life by the steady growth of the stalks and the weight of the harvest in his arms. Across the valley, the rhythm shifted entirely. Abel moved through the higher elevations where the terrain turned to rolling slopes. His life was not measured by the soil, but by the movement of the flock. His ears were filled with the constant, soft bleating of lambs that followed his path through the hills. He knew the location of every animal by the sound of its voice. While Cain pushed against the resistance of the earth, Abel walked in harmony with the living creatures in his care. One brother was bound to the permanence of the field, defined by the earth that stained his hands. The other was tethered to the pulse of the flock, guided by the sounds that drifted across the open slopes. They occupied the same world, yet they moved in different directions, each defined by the nature of his labor. The morning light sharpened, and the brothers reached a silent agreement. It was time to return the first fruits of their labor to the source of the field and the hills. Cain moved through the wheat rows with singular focus. He knelt, selecting only the tallest, most robust stalks, his hands moving with precise, deliberate speed. He gathered them into a dense, heavy bundle, pulling the base tight. He found long strands of wild grass and wrapped them around the grain, knotting the ends until the structure was firm and immovable. He set the pile aside and wiped his palms against his thighs. Across the expanse, Abel worked with a different rhythm. He walked the perimeter of his flock, eyes scanning for the singular animal that carried the mark of health and vigor. He moved slowly, calling out, until a young lamb stepped forward. Abel caught the animal, checking the fleece, ensuring it was without blemish. He guided the lamb toward the clearing where the stone altar sat, weathered and cold. He tied a lead to a nearby rock, his movements gentle and calculated. Both brothers stood back, looking at their work. The wheat stood in a rigid, golden stack, and the lamb waited in the silence. They had given their best, and now they waited for the sun to climb. The sun hit its zenith, casting short, sharp shadows against the base of the stone. A sudden, warm gust swept across the clearing, catching the edge of the altar where the lamb lay. A thin ribbon of gray rose, twisting upward into the blue, carried by the breeze until it vanished into the sky. Abel watched the drift, his breath steady, his posture relaxed. He did not move as the smoke climbed higher. thinning out against the glare of the noon sun. Beside him, the air remained heavy and still. Cain leaned forward, eyes fixed on the golden stalks piled upon his own altar. He waited for a flicker, a shift, or the slightest spark of heat to stir the grain. Nothing happened. The wheat stalks remained perfectly upright, dry, and lifeless in the stagnant air. Not a single leaf curled, not a wisp of smoke broke the silence. The wind that carried Abel's offering seemed to bypass his own, leaving the bundle cold and undisturbed. The gap between them widened in the silence. Where one brother saw the sky reach down to receive his gift, the other stood face to face with an absolute, crushing stillness that refused to acknowledge his presence. Cain did not blink. He stared at the altar until his eyes watered, waiting for a sign that never came. He looked at Abel, who stood with his head bowed, his hands clasped in quiet acceptance. The contrast burned. Cain felt the heat rise from his chest into his throat, a tight, suffocating pressure. He turned away from the altar and scanned the field. His shovel lay in the dirt where he had left it. He walked to the tool, his boots dragging through the loose soil, leaving deep, jagged furrows in his wake. He grabbed the handle. His grip tightened until the wood groaned. The skin over his knuckles pulled thin, turning the color of bleached bone. He did not look at the sky. He did not look at his brother. He stared at the dark, packed earth beneath his feet. His jaw locked hard enough to ache. Every muscle in his forearms stood out, corded and rigid. He held the shovel with such force that his pulse throbbed against the wooden grain. The silence of the field returned, thicker than before, heavy with the weight of his unmoving, silent rage. Cain dropped the shovel. It hit the ground with a dull thud, burying its edge into the dirt. He stood there for a long moment, watching the dust settle round his boots before he turned. He walked toward the hills where Abel still stood, his movements now measured and calm, a sharp contrast to the rigid tension of the previous hour. He stopped a few paces from his brother. He did not mention the altar. He did not mention the smoke. Cain pointed a finger toward the distant, tree-lined boundary of the field. "Come to the field," he said, his voice flat and devoid of its earlier heat. Abel looked up, caught off guard by the sudden shift, but nodded. Cain did not wait for a response. He turned on his heel and began to march toward the horizon, his pace steady and purposeful. Abel followed, trailing a few steps behind. They passed the familiar tents, leaving the center of their home behind them. The distance between the brothers and the dwellings grew with every stride. The golden stalks of wheat blurred into a long, unbroken wall as they moved further into the quiet, uninhabited stretches of the land. The sun began to dip, casting their long, distorted shadows onto the path ahead. The oak tree stood alone, its massive, gnarled branches creating a pocket of deep shadow that swallowed the remaining daylight. Cain reached the trunk and stopped. He did not turn. His shoulders stayed rigid, his back a wall of unyielding muscle. Abel stepped into the clearing, his boots crunching softly on the dry leaves. He looked up at the canopy, then back at his brother, waiting for a word or a gesture that never came. Cain spun around. The transition was instantaneous, a sudden snap of movement that broke the stillness of the woods. He stepped into Abel's personal space, forcing him back against the rough bark of the oak. Cain's eyes were wide, the pupils pinned tight. He did not point or gesture anymore. He balled his hands into hard, white-knuckled fists at his sides. The air between them grew thick, stagnant. Cain opened his mouth, the muscles in his neck corded and strained, and a harsh, guttural sound tore from his throat. It was not a question. It was not a plea. It was a jagged, unrestrained shout that bounced off the wood and died in the heavy, unmoving leaves above. He leaned forward, chest heaving, his face inches from his brother's, the long-suppressed anger finally burning through the silence. Cain shoved. Abel stumbled, his heels catching on a protruding root, forcing him to scramble for balance. He reached out to steady himself against Cain, but the contact only fueled the momentum. Cain lunged, his weight driving them both into the dirt. The ground erupted in a spray of dust and broken twigs. Abel twisted, trying to gain leverage, but Cain held him down with a relentless, crushing pressure. Every movement was frantic, desperate, and sharp. Arms tangled, knees struck the earth, and the air filled with the sound of labored, jagged breathing. There was no room for words now. The struggle surged back and forth, a chaotic blur of limbs beneath the low-hanging branches. Then, a sudden, jarring shift occurred. A heavy thud echoed against a forest floor. Abel went limp, his resistance vanishing as quickly as it had begun. The frantic scuffling ceased, replaced by a jarring, absolute silence. Cain remained on top, his breath hitching in his chest, his hands trembling against the earth. He stayed frozen, his eyes fixed on the motionless form beneath him, while the forest around them seemed to hold its breath. The bond between them had snapped, leaving nothing but the weight of what had just transpired. Cain pushed himself up from the dirt. He stood alone in the tall, dry grass. The sun was dipping below the horizon, bleeding a deep, bruised orange across the field. He did not look down. His shadow stretched long and thin across the path, a dark, jagged line reaching out like a finger pointing away from the oak tree. The heat of the day had vanished, replaced by the cool, creeping dampness of evening. He wiped his hands on his legs, but the sensation of the earth remained. He took a single step, then another. His shadow moved with him, tethered to his heels, a constant, silent reminder of the stillness behind him. He did not turn his head to look back. He kept his gaze fixed on the ground, watching the dust kick up around his boots as he walked. His pace quickened, turning from a slow shuffle into a steady, rhythmic stride. The golden field, once a place of labor and routine, now felt vast and empty. The wind picked up, rustling the stalks of wheat, but he did not stop to listen. He moved toward the edge of the horizon, his silhouette growing smaller as the light faded, leaving behind the only life he had ever known. Cain traveled until the familiar golden fields were nothing more than a memory blurred by distance. He crossed dry riverbeds and climbed jagged ridges, his feet hardening against the rough, unforgiving terrain. Days merged into a singular cycle of walking and searching. Finally, he reached a windswept hill, isolated from the valleys below. The ground here was thin, rocky, and stubborn. He began his work at dawn, dragging heavy stones from the slope to lay a foundation. He cleared the scrub and dug into the hard earth until his muscles burned with the strain. He constructed a shelter of rough timber and stacked stone, a structure that held no warmth and offered no comfort. Every nail he drove, every log he notched, was done in absolute silence. He stood on the crest of his new ridge as the wind whipped around him, looking out over a landscape that held no ties to his past. The fields he once knew remained empty, their rows untended and their purpose lost. He turned back to his shelter and pulled the heavy door shut, sealing himself into the quiet, hollow space. The legacy he had left behind was fractured, and here, on the summit of this distant hill, he lived out the remainder of his days in the stillness of his own making.